Coming up on today's episode of The Prodigal Life.
And so if you can think about that in terms of your life, what if somebody that was your best friend or your mentor or your mother was having to go through and witness that? What does that look like for you? And the beauty of the Seven Sorrows Rosary is you literally meditate on the Seven Sorrows of Mary, which, of course, starts with Simeon telling her, all the things she was going to hold in her heart.
And I got a call from another friend of ours saying that he died. I said, what are you talking about? I just talked to him.
Wow.
And it was just devastating. At the funeral, the same group of us who were groomsmen in his wedding were now pallbearers in his funeral. Are you away from your faith?
Do you wonder why you're Catholic? Do you really want to know more?
If God is so good and he made a beautiful and amazing world, then why does life feel so messy and difficult and painful sometimes?
Do you feel stuck and want to take your faith to that next level? Join us on The Prodigal Life as me and Ellen and Nick have an honest and open discussion about all things important in our faith life. Welcome to The Prodigal Life. Hello and welcome to The Prodigal Life. I'm Deacon Burke, Sivers, joined by Ellen and Nick. And just want to tell you about our page, about our website, theprodigalife.com, where you can get previous episodes of the podcast. You can get information about the great things we're doing in the Lord's Vineyard, the work that we're doing for Jesus. And also, you can also patronize us. That word, patronize. This is a negative connotation.
Never gets old.
But help support the work that we're doing. So if you go to the website, you'll see an opportunity there at different levels. We got the different angels there, right?
Different angels. You can be a cherubim, or you can be a archangel, or you can be a throne or a dominion. You have.
Yeah, you may not have that place in heaven, but you can have that place supporting
us,
supporting the prodigal life.
Amen.
Which is just as good.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, it's close. It's close. So, but aim for the seraphim. So, and then the other thing we would love for you to do is to download the app on your desktop or laptop or tablet. You can go to theawakenapp.io. And if you go to your Google Play Store or your Apple Store, you're going to go to the Awaken Catholic app, and it has a little sun. So it's really pretty. And then you'll be able to watch our podcast and all the other wonderful podcasts that are on the show. There's some beautiful ones. There's one called Naked Without Shame. Naked Without Shame. I'm like, wow, that's a big topic. It's a theology of the body, so you might enjoy that. And then there's also going to be music and then links to prayer. So if there's some prayers you're unfamiliar with, or you just want to, get familiar with them, you can do that. And then best and not the least, most important, is there's a beautiful messaging app that's 100% Catholic, as is the app, where you can message and communicate with your family and friends in a very safe environment, and it works when nobody else's does. Beautiful.
All right. What are we talking about, Ellen?
We're doing suffering.
All right, I'm out of here.
Yeah. Nick's bailing. He's like, no, we're not doing suffering. And Deacon, I'm going to have Deacon explain some of the misconceptions about suffering. Also, what some of our Protestant brethren and other people struggle with in suffering, and what we as Catholics struggle with, in Catholic with suffering. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk a little bit about desolation and consolation and the Ignatian exercises, which a lot of you probably don't even know what that means, but we're going to talk about it. They're beautiful, and we will put a link up to them so that you'll be able to do them if you choose to. And then we're also going to talk about, I grew up with the, offer it up. When something didn't go your way or something was wrong or whatever, I can still hear all of my family members who are all Catholic, offer it up. And so, what's that mean? What do you get around that, Deacon, with offering it up?
Well, the first thing to realize is that everybody's going to suffer.
Correct.
Every single human being is going to suffer. There's no ifs, ands, or buts of getting around it, right? So the question becomes, what do we do? How do we deal with it? So what's happening in our culture today is that we want to avoid suffering because it's meaningless. Now, back in the time of the ancient Romans, there was a tendency to avoid suffering. To emphasize the good and the pleasurable, and to avoid suffering. So things that made you feel good were good. things that made you suffer were bad, so you wanted to avoid suffering and focus on things that gave you pleasure in life. We're pretty much there today.
Again, we're back.
Except we're trying to avoid suffering because we believe suffering is meaningless. Right? So we want to avoid suffering because suffering is meaningless. But for us as Catholics, people of faith, we want to find meaning in the suffering that's unavoidable. And that's where the difference is. So we don't avoid suffering, we engage suffering because everyone's going to suffer.
Right.
What does this mean for me and what does it mean for my life? And obviously the quintessential model for suffering is Jesus Christ on the cross. So for us as people of faith, suffering has redemptive value.
Yeah.
Right? So our suffering is a participation in the suffering of Christ. You know, so we talk about offer it up. Yeah, you hear that? Well, just offer it up. What does that mean to offer it up? I mean,
yeah, what's it look like?
You know, like, do you just like say a bunch of prayers and stuff, or do you? I mean, how do you unite your suffering to the suffering of Christ? Because it's not like you can like imagine yourself being nailed on the cross, or it's not like. I mean, so what is that?
Let's contextualize the suffering of Christ too, because I think understanding the full scope of the dynamics that were at play there can help in this, in what you were wanting us to do there. So something that really struck me a moment ago as I was hearing you talk was, I just saw this headline a couple days ago where there was a child, I think he was adolescent, who was found by police sitting outside of his home, like on the front steps, covered in blood, but sitting there super peacefully and like everything was fine. And they see him covered in blood, so they storm into the house, and the parents are in the house dead. And the child had used a knife and an axe to kill both of his parents. And now, we don't know what suffering that child experienced to lead him to the point of killing his parents, killing the source of his life, in a sense, right? The people who were supposed to care for him, who gave him life, who care for him and support him and whatever. We don't know what dysfunctions there were in that house that led to this. But in the words of that child to the police, again, very calmly, in like an eerie way, he explained that he was trying to take control of his life. And I think about what just dawned on me, because I had seen this headline, I didn't think beyond just the face value, this is tragic. But now what struck me was, talking about the suffering of Christ, God, the Word, it was through the Word of God that everything was created that was created, right? And that Word of God was the third person of the Trinity. And that third person of the Trinity would incarnate and become Jesus, the Son. Or sorry, the second person. Sorry, the second person of the Trinity. And so we were created by God, and we, in our desire to take control of our lives, is what we see in the Garden of Eden. We want to take control. It's what we see with all kinds of sin, is we are wanting to take control. We want to be the gods. We're spitting in the face of our Creator and our Heavenly Father, and we, not only literally those of us who were alive in that time, which theoretically is none of us, but those humans who were alive in that time, whether it was the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, the Jews at the time, like they crucified him. They killed God. Number one, that's awful. But number two, they killed their Creator. And then for us, 2,000 years later, our sin is what put him in the position that he needed to do that. Right. And so we are just as culpable for what happened there, even though it's 2,000 years later, because he did that for all the bull crap that we pull today. Yep. Right. All of the tragic ways we hurt each other and whatever. And so we killed God, and we sent him to his death because he wanted to pay a debt that we couldn't pay. That is what that suffering was. It was the betrayal of his creation. His creation betrayed him. His creation literally crucified him. And to this day, the people at the time that crucified him, they didn't know the full story. They didn't know the whole context. They didn't. 2,000 years later, we know the full story. We still betray him. And we still sin. We still turn our backs on him. We still turn away from him to seek our own pleasure, our own glorification, whatever. So many layers of betrayal and tragedy in the death of Christ. And I just think that context is so important when we're talking about attaching our suffering to his. Well, what is his suffering? You got to consider. And then all of that, you add to that the physical pain, right, of the scourging at the pillar, the crown of thorns, the crucifixion itself. Like, there's a whole lot of suffering going on there that we're trying to be so presumptuous to attach our own suffering to. So that having been said, continue.
No, that's a great context. No, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so, and talking about uniting ourselves. So, given what Nick just said, our suffering is already enfolded in the sufferings of Christ. Right. So it's not. So Jesus definitely understands our suffering because he took all of that upon himself. So it's in a sense is that recognize that we're not suffering alone. Mm-hmm. That's why often we're going through something painful. I like to have a crucifix or hold on to a crucifix. Mm-hmm. And most of life is suffering. Let's just be real. Yeah. Psalm 90, written by Moses, our span is 70 years or 80 for those who are strong. And most of these are emptiness and pain. They pass swiftly and we are gone. Mm-hmm. Whoa.
And that was Moses. And Moses.
Psalm 90, the only one written by Moses.
He should be a motivational speaker.
But that is like our span. And then most of these are emptiness and pain because most of life is Good Friday.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's very true.
So when we recognize that fact, we talk about uniting ourselves to the suffering of Christ, then again, it's not like, like you're literally like uniting it. But what we're saying is that we can see our suffering in the suffering of Christ.
Correct.
So, and what I like to do is I like to also ask for the intercession of other saints who have suffered, especially if you're going through a particular suffering and there's saints that suffered in particular ways.
Right.
Like if you have, there's some people who woke up this morning in pain. They're in pain right now as they're watching this. Yeah. They're going to be in pain as they go to bed tonight. They're going to wake up tomorrow in pain, constantly in pain. So you think of saints who have endured suffering and painful
Saint
suffering.
Teresa, she suffered.
Yes,
and JP too for so much of his life with Parkinson's.
I mean, there's even been ones that aren't saints that we still admire, like Mother Angelica. Yeah. The end of her life was extremely painful.
Those last years.
I mean, there's people that we can look to that still remain strong in their faith, even though there was suffering. Mm-hmm. I spend a lot of time. I just recently, in the last year or so, learned about the Rosary of the Seven Sorrows of Mary, and we'll put a link up to them because they're absolutely beautiful. And I think I spend a lot of time thinking about the suffering that Mary went through. And Mary Magdalene as well. I do. Because, Mary Magdalene, for all intents and purposes, I would say, and St. John, who, the only three that remained at the cross through thick and thin, the suffering that they went through watching what, and just literally being able to observe what was being done to their best friend, technically to their, St. John, it was, he was his mentor, because that's what he was. And so if you can think about that in terms of your life, what if somebody that was your best friend or your mentor or your mother was having to go through and witness that? What does that look like for you? And the beauty of the Seven Sorrows Rosary is you literally meditate on the Seven Sorrows of Mary, which, of course, starts with Simeon telling her, all the things she was going to hold in her heart. And then it continues all the way through to the very end where she's alone with him in the tomb when he's being buried. The sixth sorrow always kind of wastes me. You know what I mean? It just breaks me every time I pray on it and every time I meditate. Is because when they took Jesus off the cross and put her dead son back into her arms. And, if you're a mother, holy mackerel, can you imagine you're watching the whole thing and then all of a sudden, then it's done. It's done and the earth is just shook and it was all of that. And there was a terrible earthquake. And I'm sure she probably didn't even know there was an earthquake because I know if that was happening to me, I wouldn't even know there was an earthquake. I would have been so fixated on looking at my dead child in front of me. And then for them, to take your baby boy off of that piece of wood and lay what was left of him, because literally stripped every piece of humanity from him back into the arms of his mother. Spend some time with that next time you're having suffering. That's what I try to do. When I'm having a really hard day, I try to get to adoration and I try to really meditate on the Seven Sorrows because it's a very powerful way to like rein in my suffering. And it doesn't invalidate my suffering. It actually helps me work through it, because I have such an inspiration for what our Blessed Mother did, and being able to say, well, how if she can push through that and she can do that, I can try and figure out a way to do this, and then, you know, offer that suffering for like the souls in purgatory. Or, you know, I sometimes implore the Lord to, you know, save a soul that's going to be aborted today, you know, with my suffering, whatever you know what I mean, and offer yourself kind of as a victim soul. You know what I mean? So that you know, if you're willing to suffer for Christ, imagine what he'll be able to do with that suffering that you're willing to go through. But be comforted by the fact that Christ is never going to abandon you, and he's never going to leave you, even though sometimes it feels that way. And that's the desolation that we'll talk about in a little while.
No, absolutely. I mean, and you think of circumstances in your life, like when my best friend died. He was the best man at my wedding. I was the best man at his wedding. And he came back he was a computer consultant, came back from a trip overseas, and it sounded like he had pneumonia. And so we talked. I said, man, you don't sound good. He said, I know, I'm going to the doctor and stuff. And as it turns out, he did not have pneumonia. He had a very aggressive form of small cell lung cancer.
Oh, geez.
So here's the tragic part. He was diagnosed on a Monday. He went to Sloan Kettering Institute in New York for a cancer treatment plan on Thursday, and he died the next day.
Wow.
So 5 days from diagnosis to death. And when I got that call, I never forget, I was sitting outside the rectory of my spiritual director. I was finishing up a breakfast sandwich before I went for my spiritual direction meeting, and I got a call from another friend of ours saying that he died. I said, what are you talking about? I just talked to him.
Wow.
You know, and it was just devastating. At the funeral, the same group of us who were groomsmen in his wedding were now pallbearers in his funeral in the same church. And the look on his wife's face when they closed that casket for the last time. He had 2 little kids.
Never forget it.
You know, it was just it was just devastating. And I thought, how do you trust God at a time like this?
Yeah.
You know, God is love. St. Thomas Aquinas, you know, God doesn't allow evil unless a greater good can come out of it.
That doesn't help.
That doesn't help. That doesn't help.
No.
You know, all the theology doesn't help at that point.
So it's pretty. It was pretty desolate. I mean, that's what
and I'm a guy who loves to pray, and I still pray, but I felt nothing. I felt completely empty and dead inside. Words were coming out of my mouth, and I didn't really mean it. I mean, I said my office. I never stopped saying the office, but usually I love to pray. I love to immerse myself in the Psalms and in prayers. But during that time, extremely difficult. I felt empty because I was trying to understand, God, what are you doing here? Right. Like, what are you doing? How is she supposed to raise those kids by herself now? Yeah. She didn't work. Yeah. What's she supposed to do now? I mean, it was really, really, really hard.
To me, that's not different than the question of even greater evils than that. Like, God, why did you let Hitler do what he did?
Yeah, right.
You know?
And that's where the atheists come in with their arguments.
And I just think that, you know, on the one hand, you have, like we've talked about in other episodes, the question of God's perfect will versus his permissive will. But I almost feel like there's got to be like a third category, because, I mean, obviously he lets anything that happens is because he allows it to happen.
Correct.
But I think that within that permissive will category, there's a whole lot of spectrum of stuff. But like, you cannot say that a good God, wanted Hitler to do what he did.
No, he
right?
didn't. But he isn't ever going to deny anyone their free will.
That's exactly right. And the challenge is that it's on us. We broke the universe. We broke the natural plan, and that's, you know, at the core of every sin is a breaking of the natural law, like the way that things are supposed to be, the way that relationships between one person or another person are supposed to be, or even one person and parts of the universe, whether it's the ecosystem or animals or whatever. Like, sin at the core is us fracturing the natural law that God created in the universe, and every time we sin, we're breaking the universe even more, and that is ultimately the redemption. On the cross and on the last day, when we have a new heaven and a new earth, God's wiping the slate clean, hitting the reset button, and it's going to be better than it ever would have been. But
there's an accountability.
The here and
now. There's an accountability, though, because sometimes we make our own suffering.
Right. Yeah.
and that's hard. That's a hard place to go.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because like you said, we broke it ourselves. And that's true. And sometimes, people are like, well, yeah, but I didn't do anything. Let's say hypothetically or go back in time, like, well, I didn't, cause Hitler to do what he did.
Yeah.
But what did you do to prevent it? You know what I mean? Were you involved in that? You know what I mean? What's your responsibility in that? So many people just stood by.
Yeah,
and
or why
waited.
are there starving children in Africa, or why are
right, when we have plenty of food?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it's like it's easy to point blame, but sometimes the suffering is self-inflicted.
Right.
And then it's a matter of going, okay, well maybe I don't want to suffer like that intentionally. Now there's a difference between intentionally suffering because you want to be benignly neglectful or not do something, and then there's intentional suffering like we were just talking about, where you offer up something that is going to be painful. Your mother's. I mean, like when my mother died, I mean it was horrible. I mean, we were all there. She died at home with hospice and everything else, but you had to figure out, because you can, and people always think, oh, if I didn't use the suffering right when it happened, can I still use the suffering? Yes. It doesn't matter. If you had somebody like your best friend who died how many years ago? It still
20.
hurt, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's still painful.
Yeah.
So why not take that and turn it into something good so that God can do, like you said, and turn something that feels evil or bad or uncomfortable and try to turn it into something good and productive, like by saying extra prayers for their children, or, you know what I mean? And say, okay, Lord, this really hurts today. Can you help me suffer in a way that will bring greater glory to you through whatever your will is?
And the difference that one person can make, like I think about that poem or parable or whatever it is that, someone's walking on the beach, picking up starfish and throwing them back into the ocean.
That's when I carried
you. No, a different one. Someone's walking on the beach, picking up starfish and throwing it back into the ocean.
Oh, yeah.
And, someone else is like, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm saving starfish. And he's like, you can't possibly save all these starfish. He throws another one in the water and says, well, I saved that one. And it's amazing the difference that one person can make. And, you look at someone like Teresa of Calcutta, one small, little, humble bombshell of a woman who didn't she literally stop a war? I mean, didn't she walk out? Was it her that walked out into a battlefield and was like, "Hey, we're not going to do this, guys"?
Right.
There's some story like that, I think. But the difference one person can make by being bold and doing something, even if it seems scary.
Right.
And how many of the people in Calcutta or elsewhere in that region, how many of those people, their suffering would have been worse, and they wouldn't have been fed, and they wouldn't have this, that, and the other thing if it weren't for this one woman's yes. One person can make a huge difference. You, viewer, listener, you can make a difference. I could make a bigger difference than I'm making if I said yes more often. That's a fact.
Yeah.
Yep. And part of that, to get to that place, we have to follow what John says in his epistle, right? Perfect love casts out all fear.
Right.
So we have to learn how to love more than be afraid. But one of the things I love to do is when I go to the Holy Land, and you've been there, and
we've been twice
in the cistern on Holy Thursday night where Jesus was placed before he went before Pilate the next day, and you go down in that room, and it's dank. And it's like literally a pit, and it's like a cistern. So there was water in there at the time of Christ. So Christ is in this room that's damp, it's musky, it's dark.
He's alone.
And they have a little stone kind of lectern there with Psalm 88. Psalm 88 is a psalm that's traditionally attributed to what Christ prayed when he was in that cistern on Holy Thursday night. It's a psalm that was, the music for it was composed by one of the musical guild guys. That one I think is...
We can put up Psalm 88.
Yeah.
We'll put it up for you.
I think it's Ethan the Ezrahite. So Ethan, or Etan in Hebrew, it's Ethan or Nathan in English, means firm, lasting, permanent, solid. Nice. And he's listed as a son of Kashiah there. And so that psalm is also what's called the Mahalat Letnaoth psalm. It's the loose translation is sad song.
Yeah. Do you have it pulled up, Nick?
Yeah.
But literally it means the sickness of affliction. The sickness of affliction. But part of that psalm says, and how many times have we felt this going through something really hard? You have laid me in the depths of the tomb, in places that are dark, in the depths. Your anger weighs down upon me. I am drowned beneath your waves. You have taken away my friends. I'm skipping around here. My eyes are sunken with grief. And then skipping to the end, Lord, why do you reject me? Don't we feel that?
Sometimes.
Like when we're going through suffering, where are you right now, Lord?
Right.
I don't feel you're not here. Why aren't you with me? Why aren't you taking this from me? Why do you hide your face? I have borne your trials. I am numb. Friend and neighbor you have taken away. My one companion is darkness. That's
heavy.
That line gets me my one companion is darkness. Thinking about Jesus in that room in the dark praying this psalm.
It's the most powerful experience.
It's just, and it helps you appreciate the depths of Christ's suffering.
Yeah.
Because it's easy just to think of it as something that happened a long time ago, but that's why I watch The Passion of Christ, the movie, every Good Friday.
And then when you're in that pit, and you worded it, you described it as being a pit, and in my translation, yours said tomb, mine said pit, and so it actually described it the way that you described it.
Yeah. It's a powerful experience if you ever go there. But what you were saying, Deacon, about why, what I mean? Why have you abandoned me? Why do you? Because you feel so alone. That speaks exactly to desolation. St. Ignatius talks about, of Loyola talks about proficiently and explains it. And I always thought at the moments when I felt the most desolate and felt the furthest, because you yourself, for me, I always feel the furthest away. Like, if I don't feel close to Christ or if I'm feeling like that. But actually, that is when Christ is closest to you. And I was like, what? And I had to wrap my head around that, because when you're in consolation, that's like when everything's good and you know what I mean? And you know that the Lord's present and you feel like everything's going good and everything is just hunky-dory peachy keen. And that's fabulous. But it's only when you're in desolation that you truly understand how much Christ and God really love you, because you're experiencing these things because he trusts you. You're experiencing them because he knows that he's going to be there to help you get through them. And it's finding that piece of faith or belief within yourself that even in the hardest of times, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay as long as you don't take your eye off the prize. That's what I always say, the eye off the, you know what I mean? And the prize is what's right behind my head, which is eternal life. And that's how to me, desolation, the Ignatian exercises are a very, very deep dive into learning how to deal with suffering and learning how to remain humble in consolation and learning how to remain firm and steadfast and persevere through the times that are darkest in your life. I mean, how do you guys relate to the Ignatian exercises and desolation?
Well, I've never done them, but
really?
But no. Although in Europe I've been to, the cave there where he wrote it's just beautiful. I didn't think I'd be moved as much as I was actually by St. Ignatius of Loyola. Never really thought of him very much or the Jesuits very much, but it was profound.
Same thing happened to me because I had never had much of a connection to him or anything, and I was on pilgrimage in Spain, and we were, I guess, in the castle that he lived in, and I didn't put two and two together in my head, and we end up in this chapel that they call the Conversion Chapel, and I'm like, oh, this is nice, and I'm like, why does it look like this? Because it's kind of like a bedroom, and they're like, oh, because it's St. Ignatius's bedroom where he was laid up when he was recovering from being wounded in battle, and this is where he had these visions and ended up converting, and I was like, oh, so that's why it's the Conversion Chapel, you know. And I ended up getting to lead worship there and lead some musical worship while we were before the Blessed Sacrament in adoration right there in St. Ignatius's bedroom, and I just ended up having this profound experience, even though before that moment I never cared much about St. Ignatius. But yeah, with desolation, man, my wife and I both kind of struggle a lot with seasonal affective disorder. And so if the lighting is just wrong or the skies are just the right type of gloomy or whatever, we just get wrecked. And it's so hard. And we're finally, I think, coming into a place now after years of dealing with this, both of us, that we're kind of getting some tools in our arsenal that help us with that. But you really can start to like, one of the effects for us has for both of us been a feeling of desolation, where when we're affected by it, we have a really hard time feeling like connected to God, or is he even there, and some of that desolation has been really hard for us. And then especially for Alina, when you combine that with like the postpartum stuff, and then for me, back when I was working 9 to 5 at the diocese or at parishes, and I wouldn't be with her to help her through the seasonal affective disorder plus postpartum. So I was dealing with it was a hot mess. And it can be really hard. And there's so many different reasons someone can find themselves in desolation. We've mentioned Mother Teresa a few times. She was in desolation for a lot of her life.
Yes.
And you wouldn't have even known that necessarily without some of her journals coming out after the fact.
Yeah, and that's what the movie The Letters is about.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah. That'd be a good movie
and
to watch.
So what I took from that, actually, Nick, to your point, after watching that movie about Mother Teresa, is that she was allowed through almost her whole ministry to experience what the people she's serving experienced. See, that's what I took away from it. So and I never thought about it like that before. Yeah. But people just have an idea, but she physically was allowed to experience all the people she's serving, what they experienced. Powerful. And I think that actually enhanced the way that she provided service. And one thing about desolation we have to remember, because this is important, because people will look at Christ on the cross. He's praying Psalm 22. First of all, why is he praying that psalm? He's, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the verse everybody wants to focus on, right? And then you have some misunderstandings of that where they say, well, Jesus, God just abandoned his son on the cross. He took all his rage and all his wrath and he poured that out. What father would ever do that to his child? That's ridiculous. Look, here's what's going on. First of all, Psalm 22, again, written by David, is a messianic psalm of fulfillment. So in other words, that psalm was written 700 years before Christ. But what do they say in that psalm? They tear holes in my hands and my feet and lay me in the dust of death. I can count every one of my bones. These people stare at me and gloat. They throw dice for my clothes. Right? It talks about it says there's a part in there that people that often skip over this part, but it says it was you who brought me from the womb. You trust me to my mother's breast. And who's standing at the foot of the altar? Mary. It's beautiful. It's like a son crying out to his mom in pain, like we all do, like, Mom, right? Yeah. And so that's the first reason, because he's saying that psalm to see all the people there. This psalm is being fulfilled, right? You are here witnessing the fulfillment of the psalm. Wow. Yeah. The second reason why he's praying that psalm, not because he's God. How can he be separated from God? That's not the point. But in his human nature, he was allowed to experience the isolation and the desolation we've all felt. We're going through something really hard and we think that God is not there. Wow. So he was allowed to experience that. And that was like, what, why? So he could redeem it. That not even death can separate us from the power of God's love. That's the point.
That's beautiful.
That's the point. And I just want to give a little shout out there. Look, if you're struggling and you can't do anything else in the midst of your pain, try this. This is what I did when Craig died, my best friend died. Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I trust you. Jesus, I give my life to you. If you can't say or pray anything else, there's some simple words of consolation. Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I trust you. Jesus, I give my life to you. And it was in adoration, praying that prayer and reflecting on the meaning of suffering, Blessed Mother, all of that, where I really began to develop a deeper understanding and a recovery, basically, back to myself again. Because like I said, I had a hard time praying. I'm a guy who loves to pray. And I was like... How
long did it take you to work through all that, if you had to guess?
3 or 4 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. Every week got better. It got better.
Right.
But just why? Because as a human being, you want to understand things. Right. Like,
and it did make sense.
On the other side of the booth, there's all this sound equipment, all these cameras, all these mixing boards, and you look at it like, I have no idea how that stuff works. But as a human being, we want to try and figure out how things work.
You actually sat down at the desk and you were like, I want to press a button.
yeah, exactly. But as human beings, one of the things we have to be people of faith, we have to understand we will not always understand why things happen because God has a will, and God's will is not our will. Correct. We don't understand God's mind. because we're not God.
Right.
You know, so, and we won't understand probably till we get to heaven what the full implications of all these things mean. But we have to trust.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of pain and suffering, we have to trust.
Amen.
Right. And he's closest to you when you think he's farthest away. And that is that's why, you know, keep praying your prayers even when you don't feel it, because eventually you will. And then that's the salvific.
Well, it's like marriage too, right? Sometimes you don't feel like you love your spouse.
Yeah.
Let's be real. I mean, you know, some of that wears off.
I'm not going to say that on camera.
Well, no, I mean, you know, because, you know, you get married, it's so exciting, and then the years go by, kids come, job, all that kind of stuff, and the initial feeling like, my heart is exploding because I'm standing next to you. I mean, some of that fades over time.
Right.
You know, but so you may not feel that love, but that doesn't mean you don't stop loving.
I still feel it, babe.
No? I know you still feel it.
He does. He really does. Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed, I can't bring her. I don't think there's been an episode I haven't brought her up. So
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. But, you know, but God is love.
Yeah. The other thing that I just thought of with what you were saying a moment ago, I think in the last episode you mentioned the thing about the blockages in our
like arteries,
arteries and stuff, and like a lot of times what we're perceiving as desolation, we're the ones that are abandoning God. Yeah. And we don't even realize we're doing it sometimes, you know, whether it's our pride or, you know, we might be, you know, sinning out of pride and not even realize we're sinning, right? Are we living prideful lives? Like, do we think we're better than other people, or are we excited about the experiences we have that other people don't have? Or are we, you know, I don't know. There's a million ways that we could be committing sin and not even realize it. But we can just be like distancing ourselves, but we perceive God is just this limitless fountain, waterfall, gushing with love and mercy and desire for us. So he's never, you know, explicitly holding himself. He couldn't hold himself back if he wanted to. He's just all love. He's love, 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 love. Take more of my grace, please. Offers it to us in the sacraments. If it weren't that way, he would like limit how many times we can go to confession. Yeah. We can go to confession as many times as we want to, and we should, you know, temper that with a concern for scrupulosity. That's different. But like, we can go to Mass every single day, receive him in the Eucharist. He never stops wanting to give himself to us. We are the ones that create blockages through sin or through whatever number of situations, wounds, whatever. Right. And so that's another thing to consider in this question of desolation is like, man, what are we doing that is keeping us from hearing his voice or seeing him in our lives or feeling him? You know, like what are the things? And it might not apply the same way to everybody, but it's a question that should be asked.
No, I totally agree. Yeah. You know, sometimes we have a childlike reaction to what we're going through, right? Because, you know, you're in pain. I'll show you, God. I'll stop going to church. I'll stop praying. Right. I'll stop. Because you know, how many times I've heard from people who have left the church because of a tragedy that happened in their life. They lost a spouse. They lost a child. They, you know, there was something, and their response to that is to blame God. And I'm going to hurt God just like I'm hurting. Right. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to stop praying. I'm going to stop loving you. I'm going to stop this. And you know, so you're right. So that is a human reaction sometimes. Right. That when we're in that space, we want someone to feel just as bad as we do, or blame God and try somehow to hurt God.
And you really and
we end up hurting ourselves.
You will end up hurting yourself. One thing I was thinking of, just to kind of wrap this up, when Jesus had to go into the desert, you know what I mean, for the 40 days and 40 nights, that was some pretty intense suffering that he had to go through. I just even was thinking about that, you know what I mean, in relation to what we've been talking about, you know, because he was tempted by the devil. You know what I mean? He didn't eat. He had no food. You know what I mean? He's just there, completely open and exposed, like completely vulnerable to whatever his Father's will was. And he accepted it. And he did it. And you know he had to suffer. And you know it had to be really, really arduous. And I think, you know, there's so many examples that Christ and our mother and God give us throughout, you know, the Bible and the stories and the saints and everything else, that, you know, when we're having a moment of weakness, or we're having, you know, a blaming moment, which, you know, we're human, we're going to blame people, or, you know, we're having desolation or whatever. I think we have to have better understanding of that suffering that they went through, so that we can hopefully comfort ourselves with that to recover more quickly. You know what I mean? From being in pain. You know, I think we need to help each other and love one another.
Amen.
No. Yeah, well, Jesus in the desert was 40 days. That number is significant.
Very.
40 in the Bible is the number of gestational weeks in a pregnancy. So it represents a time of trial and testing and waiting. So that he's preparing his mission. And if you're pregnant, that's trial, testing, and waiting. That's painful, right? So there is a suffering, there is a pain that goes on with the 40 years in the desert, wandering around. Right. I mean, that's a time, because after that, God is going to do something. God is preparing you for something. And through the pain, what is he preparing us for? Heaven. What does Paul say? Christ was made perfect through suffering. His was made perfect through suffering.
Wow.
Well, but that just like, wait, that doesn't compute. Unless you think of it the way we've been discussing, it's redemptive suffering, salvific suffering.
Redemptive suffering.
Yeah, redemptive suffering. Well, again, a document I like to recommend is Salvifici Doloris.
We'll put that on. We'll link you to
by
it.
St. John Paul II on the meaning of suffering.
Wow.
Phenomenal document.
Yep.
I again recommend that people read that. They really want to understand how we respond to suffering as Catholics.
It's important. Yeah, and when we put up the link to the Ignatian exercises, Father Timothy Gallagher has a beautiful YouTube that you can do, and it's really a lovely.
Yeah, he has a series on EWTN too.
On EWTN, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's really good.
Highly recommend Father Gallagher when he does that. All right, well, this is suffering, and now we're gonna go and we're going to love one another and be willing to do God's will.
Hopefully not suffering.
Yep, and we'll see you at the next episode. Turn back in.
Take care and God bless everybody. Bye-bye. We'll keep you in our prayers.
Yes.